Hello and welcome to the Crime and Sacrifice podcast. This is episode 2, Didar Hossain. Bangladesh is one of the biggest garment manufacturers in the world, second only to China. There's a lot of reasons for this, but of course, like many industries, it has a lot to do with the cheap labor costs there. Bangladesh is still a country where many of its people live in poverty and really have no choice but to work at these factories. Another thing that is well documented in Bangladesh's garment industry is that there are either not enough regulations in place or not enough enforcement when it comes to worker safety. In early 2013, there had already been several infamous incidents where garment workers were killed in tragic but probably preventable accidents. The Rana Plaza building was one structure that housed several floors of factories for the garment industry. The building was originally designed to be 4 stories tall and was home to various shops, a bank, and a nursery. However, several upper floors had been added to the original 4 without any permits or building inspections. They had been converted to factory space, creating clothing for recognizable brands like Joe Fresh and Walmart. On April 23, 2013, people on the lower floors of the Rana Plaza building noticed with alarm as sudden cracks showed up in one of the central support pillars of the building. Officials immediately called for a complete evacuation, which included the garment workers from the building's upper levels. Engineers soon arrived on scene to assess the structural integrity of the building and determined that it was no longer safe. However, soon after this, the owner of the building, Sohail Rana, contradicted the engineers and told media outlets that the building was completely safe. This led to garment industry supervisors stating publicly that employees were to return to work the next day, threatening to withhold a month's worth of wages for any workers that failed to show up. And again, many of these workers were poor and could not afford to lose a month's worth of wages, let alone their jobs altogether. The garment workers returned virtually in full force the next day. On April 24th, as thousands of workers filed back into the upper factory floors, many felt apprehensive, a certain dread that something was going to happen. At around 8:45 a.m., the power snapped off suddenly, machinery slowing to a halt. This wasn't necessarily unusual, and generators had been installed so that work could continue if and when the power was disrupted. Management then made the decision to turn the generators on so that work could continue. The generators were very noisy and vibrated a lot. The structure started to shake violently and soon caused a ripple effect that began to spread throughout the entire building, all 8 floors starting to pancake onto one another, with close to 3,000 workers inside. The immediate loss of life was staggering, with hundreds of workers dying instantly and many others suffering severe injuries as they remained stuck in the rubble with no way of getting medical assistance. A garment worker at a different building named Didar Hossain heard the deafening sound from the collapse and looked out the window to see a wall of dust where the Rana Plaza building had been. He was overcome by a desire to go out and help if he could. A security guard tried to stop him on his way out the door, warning him of the danger, but Didar would not stop, compelled to try to do something to help what he knew were thousands of his neighbors now trapped in the rubble across the way. As he approached, he was shocked to find what had once been a tall building now looked like it was only 3 stories tall. Didar figured that there could be survivors trapped inside and began digging and crawling his way into the sea of rubble to try to help. He eventually entered what had been the 6th floor of the building and was immediately greeted by the grim sight of a dead body. In interviews after the incident, Didar talks about the incredible fear he felt. But there was some persistence in him, an ability to put aside his fear because he wanted to help, and he felt tremendous empathy for the people still alive, how he would want to be helped if he was one of them. So Didar proceeded to pull the first body out of the building, hoping for closure for their family. Then he grabbed the only tool he had, a hammer, and crawled his way back inside the rubble to help whoever he could find. The way that the building fell resulted in many small cavities and pockets, so there were many workers still alive. and Didar could hear many of them calling for help. Didar was able to reach several of them that first day, and, though disoriented and suffering wounds, many were able to follow him to safety. However, there were others that were pinned some way beneath the rubble and could not get out on their own. All it would take is for the rubble to shift in some way for them to be crushed completely. It's difficult to imagine the fear. Didar had been working for over 24 hours without any sleep or much to eat when he came across a young girl named Ana Akhtar, maybe 10 years old, who was trapped. She was about 75 feet into the rubble on what had been the third floor of the building, and when Didar found her, he was dismayed to find that her right hand was trapped beneath mountains of heavy and immovable pieces of rubble. Ana was crying and was thankful that Didar was there beside her. Her biggest fear was that he would leave her behind, and she begged him to take her with him. But Didar could not get her hand free. That's when Ana first proposed cutting off her hand to free her if necessary. The arm was already mangled, and she wanted to get out of the rubble as quickly as possible. However, Didar could not imagine taking such an action, and determined to find somebody better equipped, to find a doctor. Promising to return, he left the rubble and soon found a doctor outside. But when the doctor eyed the entry that Didar proposed, the man was terrified of entering the carnage-filled and unstable rubble. He pressed a knife and some anesthetics into Didar's hands and told him that he would have to amputate the girl's hand himself. Most of us can imagine that the fear would be overwhelming at this point, but Didar said later that he felt a kind of determination then, with a very clear goal and purpose to get Ana out. Didar returned to Ana's side once more, still not able to comprehend the thought of amputating her hand himself. He tried again desperately to pull her free, but it proved impossible. And so Ana pleaded with him again to amputate her hand. Didar knew there was no other way to get her out, and that no doctor was coming. And he also knew how precarious the situation was, that she was losing blood and needed medical care. Ana, too, showed incredible bravery as Didar finally relented and began to apply the anesthetic to her arm. She was completely conscious and watched as Didar began his grim work. She could not help but to scream, and Didar screamed too, both of them crying, an impossible burden for Didar as he finished the job. When it was over, Didar tied the weakened Ana to his body and slowly pulled her through the path he had made to safety. He left her in the care of medical workers and returned to his work. Near where the girl had been, there were also 2 men who had limbs trapped by the rubble. They witnessed Didar saving her and begged him as he returned to amputate their limbs too, one whose leg was caught under a beam and another with a foot that was stuck. Didar proceeded to try to help them too, this time without anesthesia. He began amputating their limbs as requested, cutting off the leg of one who showed great strength and was able to pull himself to safety. The other, Didar tied to his body and pulled the 75 feet to the outside world, as he had done with Ana. In the end, Didar helped 34 survivors make it to safety and spent over 48 hours on scene, resting only to grab food or water that people in the community had brought before climbing back into the rubble to continue his search. After 50 hours straight of physically and emotionally exhausting work, Didar went home to rest, falling ill almost immediately from the exhaustion, tired beyond words but unable to sleep. Ana Akhtar survived her ordeal, and Didar was able to visit her in the hospital. They had spent around 5 hours together with Didar's attempts to save her and were bonded in some way through the trauma. When they were reunited, Didar apologized for not being able to save her hand. Ana would not hear of it, apologizing instead to Didar that he had to go through something so horrible to save her. His actions and the actions of many other people that day were one of the bright spots in what was otherwise an entirely preventable tragedy. Over 1,100 people died that day, and 2,500 others were injured. Sohail Rana, the owner of the building who directly contradicted engineers and encouraged workers to return the following day, was convicted of related corruption charges and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He and others deemed responsible for the tragedy are still awaiting murder charges that have been held up in Bangladeshi courts for years. If convicted of these charges, he and the others could face the death penalty. As for the garment industry, many brands were publicly called out for how they contributed to this and other tragedies, and there were efforts to make things better, in some cases real progress, including the Accord on Fire and Building Safety, signed by more than 200 brands, and resulting in tens of thousands of potential hazards being corrected in over 1,000 factories. Brands also created a $30 million trust to help victims of the Rana Plaza tragedy, though a New York Times article years later shows that only some of the survivors received any kind of compensation, an average of around $600. And many of the agreements signed have finite lifespans. There has also been widespread union suppression in Bangladesh and backlash for workers demanding higher wages. In 2018, the minimum wage was 32 cents an hour, and some workers have lost their jobs for demanding more. It's obviously not going to be an easy fight, but there is hope because consumers are becoming more aware of the real cost of fast fashion, and we, the consumers, have the ability to make brands listen. If you want to learn more about how to get involved, the Clean Clothes Campaign seems like one organization that is doing a lot for garment workers in Bangladesh. We'll have a link in the episode notes, and you can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode at crimeandsacrifice.com. You can also find all of the resources we used, some photos of the devastation, a link to a photo of Anna and Didar together, and the transcript for this episode. I've tried to find out where Anna and Didar are today, but it's difficult to find any current information about them. They may still be working in the garment industry in Bangladesh. My hope is that they're doing well, and I'll say that knowing people like Didar exist makes me feel hopeful for us all. Thank you so much for listening to the Crime and Sacrifice podcast. What kind of person will you choose to be?